And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the themes of the book, as well as some of the records that Dr. Milteer used to do this work. We're going to pull the veil back a little bit on the whole research process of doing a book like this, which is pretty expansive. So Dr. Milteer has his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He also has a BA from North Carolina State University. He's currently assistant professor at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, but he's moving, I understand, to George Washington University. Previously, he had published North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1750 to 1885, with Louisiana State University Press. And so this book, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, of course, expands the geographical range of that study significantly. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Milteer.
Thank you all for coming out today. I really appreciate it. I see some familiar faces, new faces, so it's great to see everyone. I think this is probably the largest crowd I've had, in the COVID era, so I really appreciate it. So what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about the book and its origins, what I'm trying to do, and then we'll go into the discussion. So usually what I do, and I'm going to do this today too, is just read a little bit from the book to give you a sense of what I'm working with. So in the introduction of the book, I write about a man named Amariah Reed. And so in the introduction I write, over the course of nearly 80 years, Amariah Reed lived out a life that was typical of many men of his generation in the South. Born a subject of the British Crown around 1762, in Nesbitt County, Virginia, by age 16, Reed had enlisted in the effort to overthrow British power in Virginia and several other colonies. After participating in various skirmishes against British forces, Reed was present for the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. Following the war, Reed returned to Nesbitt County, settling down on an 80-acre tract with his growing family by the early 1800s. Reed's 80 acres eventually became the inheritance of his children, who would continue to prosper from the foundations laid by their father. Yet Amariah Reed also stood apart as a man who was born free in a time when most other people of color in the future U.S. South were born enslaved. Unlike the majority of people termed, quote-unquote, colored in his community, Reed could and did hold title to personal and real property. He could work for himself, provide for his family, and keep his wages without interference from a white master. In the courts of Virginia, he could sue and be sued. As a free person of color, however, he was also subjected to an increasing number of restrictions and forms of legal discrimination. Since the time of his birth, Virginia law prevented him from enjoying some of the civil rights possessed by his white male neighbors, including the right to vote and the ability to hold public office. When Reed decided to spend the rest of his life with Betsy Skeeter, Virginia law prohibited them from marrying because he was quote-unquote colored and she was quote-unquote white. By the time of his death, the state had passed laws that prohibited Reed from traveling freely between Virginia and other localities, required him to obtain a license in order to own a gun, and demanded that he register with county officials in order to receive documents proving his free status. Reed was wedged in a precarious position of being both free and yet a person of color. And so this little snippet from the beginning of the book gives you a sense of what I'm discussing in the larger project of this push and pull between the opportunities of freedom that free people of color had in the South, and that would include Virginia, but also the limitations that they had to deal with and the developing politics around their lives that took place in Southern legislatures. And so that's one thing I'm trying to get at. Also, Reed is important for another reason, and that's because he's my ancestor. And so his connection to me is part of my inspiration for researching this topic of free people of color. So as a kid, I started working on my family history, learning about my family background, and learned about many of my ancestors who were free people of color. And in doing that research, I ended up drawing connections between my family and other families that were free in that time period. And eventually that got me to dig deeper, write some of my earlier books, and then I decided to keep going and look at the larger South. So that's where we are today on that topic. So also before we begin, I should just give a brief definition of free people of color. I don't think a lot of people have heard that terminology outside of historical circles or genealogy circles, but free people of color was a term that could include a wide swath of people who were of African and or Native American ancestry. And there are also a few instances in which people from South Asia were categorized as persons of color as well in the colonial period in 19th century. So that just gives you a sense of who we're dealing with and who I'm talking about in this project. So I'll stop there and we can begin the conversation. Okay, there we go.
So again, just to make sure you know who the cast of characters are, I'm Gregg Kimball. I'm one of the directors here at the library, and Vince Brooks here, who's with Local Records. So just a little bit more framing. One of the things that I think sometimes confuses our researchers when they come in is it's a really different thing to be a free person of color in, say, 1780 than it is in, say, 1850. And geography, right?
Right.
Are you in Louisiana? Are you in Virginia? Are you in Georgia? Could you explain a little bit of what those differences would look like in terms of the experience of a free person of color?
Right. So as far as experience of free people of color is concerned, in geography, the majority of free people of color were located in the Upper South, so in states like Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. There were also large populations in Delaware, and then the outlier would be Louisiana. And so how their experiences would vary based on location. Some of that has to do with how people became free. So it seems in some of these locations you see a larger population of people who either were formerly enslaved or were recent descendants of people who were enslaved, whereas in some other locations you would have seen people who had connections to colonial era free people of color, and those people may have been free because of their maternal ancestry in many cases. So these are people who had white mothers or grandmothers, or in some cases Native American mothers or grandmothers. And I mean, these people exist in all these different regions, but it does seem in places, say, like Maryland and Virginia in particular, by the time you get into the later period that I'm discussing, so the 1850s to 1860s, a larger percentage of the people who are in those communities have some relatively recent connections to enslavement. Also, when we're thinking about region and variability in their lives, we have to think about the law and the impacts of the law on people's lives. And in many ways, I show, and other historians have shown this as well, that the way that the laws discriminating against free people of color were interpreted, a lot of that took place at the local level. But if we're just looking at what's happening at the state level, what kind of laws are being passed at the state level, I would say that you see some of the more strict laws actually in Virginia compared to some other places, whereas North Carolina, a place that I've focused on quite a bit, tends to be a little bit more behind in the restrictions that it creates. In the most extreme case, you would see there was a movement in the 1850s approximately that attempted to enslave free people of color. And so there were attempts to pass laws that would make that happen. It was only successful in the state of Arkansas, and it failed in other parts of the South. But different states came up with roundabout ways to make life difficult for free people of color. And again, Virginia was one of those states that found those roundabout ways of doing that. But again, it would depend on where you were located as to how that would look in your day-to-day life. But that's just to give you a general perception of what's going on.
Yeah, and you mentioned the local level, and I know that's something Vince is, I'm sure, experienced in looking at the many records here, that it can really vary tremendously depending on that local context. Vince, did you have a question you'd like to ask?
Yeah, I was curious, first of all, just generally about your research process. I mean, a lot of these are needles in haystacks, and you've got to do a lot of digging. And one of the things that is challenging for folks new to research to understand is everything is not Googleable or available on Ancestry.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about what you did to research this book?
Right. So researching this book was a very long process and something that took developing expertise in different areas of when it comes to looking at different types of documents. So, of course, as I had mentioned earlier, my interest in the topic came out of being a family historian. So as a family historian, some of the earlier records that I looked at were things like census records, death records, things of that nature. But as I became more interested in the topic of free people of color as a scholar, I started to dive into record sets such as petitions, and these are petitions often at the local level or at the state level. I looked at military records, so say Civil War pension records, Revolutionary War pension records. So for instance, that little bit of the book that I read to you earlier, some of that came from a Revolutionary War pension record. Tax records are very useful. Looking at the law, you have to look at different law books that were published in the past to find those laws that deal with free people of color. Also, I used a lot of criminal records. So these are records that would describe the various alleged violations that free people of color supposedly committed. And there's a lot of information in those records as well, not only about the crimes, but about the local context and how local government worked. And so that was really important in trying to discuss the broader experiences of free people of color in the South.
One of the things that I've noticed in a few records, and that is, I guess most people, when they think about particularly the repression of black people in America, they think of segregation and the one-drop rule, basically. But it seems that some states, including Virginia, actually these definitions, and I'll use the term as a historical term, but black, mulatto, had specific legal meanings, and even people who had, I think in Virginia, at least in some cases, more than 3/4 of white ancestry could be termed white. What did you find in terms of that, in terms of definitions of color across these various states?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, that people's interpretation of where individuals belong racially was very local. Those decisions were made locally, and often they were individual. And that these calculations about percentages or fractions of blood didn't play as much of a role in how people were categorized. A lot of it had to do with what local people thought, what they knew about your family and your ancestry, what you looked like, who you were connected to, how you operated within the general society. I think a lot of that had to do more with how people were being categorized and thought about. And sometimes you will see that certain individuals, of course, may be looked at by one group of people one way and another group of people in another way. So you will see instances where an individual in one record might be listed as an Indian, and then another record listed as a mulatto, which from what I can find just means that your background is kind of ambiguous. We don't know what you are per se, but you're not a white person, right? And people can go back and forth, and you'll see individuals who are categorized 2, 3, 4 different ways in a lifetime, which I think a lot of people don't go in assuming that that is possible, but that's indeed what's going on. And that's happening across the South. And as we get into the later period that I'm discussing, so the 1840s, the 1850s, 1860s, you will see some states trying to provide certain individuals with a little bit more protection from discriminatory law by creating categories for these individuals to fit in where they're not white, but they're not exactly Negroes or black either. So here in Virginia, for instance, there was a law that was passed that allowed people to go to court and be declared not Negroes. And so that would give them an exemption from certain discriminatory laws. And sometimes they would just, come up with these stories or have somebody else come up with a story explaining their backgrounds, saying, oh, well, so-and-so's grandfather was this, but we don't really know what that person was. The other grandparent was white, this grandparent was white, so therefore, we should go ahead and categorize this person as not a Negro and not subject this person to the various forms of discrimination that other people of color would have faced. So that's something that you see, and it's also used in court cases where people try to protect themselves from discriminatory punishments, because there were certain punishments that could only be used against people of color or people who were categorized as free Negroes or whatever terminology was used in the specific statute.
Probably would come into play as well if you were testifying against a white person, right?
Right, exactly, because in the law, people of color in most parts of the South are not supposed to be testifying against white people, and that would include free people of color as well as enslaved people.
One of the things I thought was really important about your book was you talked about people having certain economic opportunities as free people of color and people, starting businesses and doing these things. But then there's also that, you talk a little bit about people being perceived as an economic threat and how that might be then, they are living perhaps decades in a community and then they're more of an economic threat than they had been, and their status is challenged or their ability to do certain things is challenged.
Right, yeah. So I think in discussing those particular issues, what I was trying to get at is the importance of class distinctions amongst free people of color. Is something that often isn't paid a lot of attention to, that the class status of free people of color mattered in how they experienced their lives, how they experienced discrimination, how their neighbors treated them. And as far as people being targeted because they are actually successful in their community, I think what I was trying to show there in my work is some of the motivation behind discriminatory laws, because what I'm trying to do in my work is not only talk about how people were discriminated against, but try to explain why, and try to explain specifically why lawmakers and their supporters would want to pass those types of discriminatory laws. And so it seems that in a lot of cases it is this economic competition that's playing an important role in at least pushing these laws or pushing attempts to pass laws discriminating against free people of color. And so I thought that that was really important to make that connection between why discrimination is happening and these class differences amongst free people of color.
Well, sort of circling back to the genealogy discussion and what got you started in this, one of our big current projects going on with the Virginia Untold Project is to digitize all of the free black registers that are in our collection, which is going to be, I think, a really helpful for folks doing family history research and other kinds of research. But one of the things that your book points out, and I think it's really good as a general rule about records, is that sometimes the number of registrations in a locality does not reflect the full number of people who were free in a locality. So only portions were registered. So if someone's doing research and they don't find their ancestor who they might believe was a free person in the register, they might need to look in lots of other places to kind of ferret them out because they just didn't register.
Right, exactly. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with these registers, but basically they are books with entries of free people of color. They're often called free Negro registers or registers of free Negroes and mulattoes, whatever the different title is for each county. And in these registers, you would have an entry with a name, a physical description, and usually a description of how that individual became free. There may be some other additional information as well. And I and other historians have recognized that these records are often incomplete. So if you'll look at, say, census data, you'll see a certain number of people who are categorized as free people of color in the census, and then you'll look at these books and you'll see that often there are fewer people in the books than there are counted in the census. And so by looking at that, you can recognize pretty quick that everybody is not registering in these books, although Virginia law, if you looked at the law without looking at the books or looking at the census, you would just imagine that everybody was registering and that these laws were affecting the lives of all these free people of color, and that's not really the case. And as far as like the research part of that, and thinking about this as a genealogical issue, I think that by recognizing that, it pushes people who are looking for their family histories to go deeper than just these records that are specifically labeled for free people of color or free Negroes or free blacks or whatever terminology you might be looking at that's related. That you have to sometimes go in a different direction. And so that direction for one person might be the census, which would be very simple. For another individual, that might be going to those criminal records. I mean, there are individuals who show up in criminal records who show up nowhere else in the record books or similar records, court minutes, things like that. Tax records is another situation where you might find an individual in a tax record and that individual will show up nowhere else. And I think that was particularly useful for me early on in doing my genealogical research because, as I mentioned at the beginning, my ancestor was from Nansemond County, Virginia, which is now the city of Suffolk. And Nansemond County had a large number of its records destroyed in courthouse fires. And so one of the few records that survives that you can find here at the Library of Virginia is tax records. And so those tax records were really important in trying to reconstruct the population of free people of color in Nansemond County. And I should add on top of that the census records, early census records, are also not available for that part of Virginia. So those tax records were really the only thing I could work with.
On that subject, is there any, did you perceive any logic to who did register versus who did not? For instance, just as a complete guess, but maybe someone who owned property might register in the sense that they had something to lose, I guess you would say, because there were penalties, right, for people who were not, if they were caught without their free papers. Do you have some sense of how that might have fallen out? Who didn't register and why, and who did and why?
Right. I think it's really hard to figure out exactly, but my best guess would be that a large percentage of the people, especially early on, who registered tend to be people who were manumitted, people who had just obtained their freedom. Now, they all don't register, but many of them do. Also, people who are traveling tend to register. So people who decide they want to leave the state of Virginia and go somewhere else. So there's a migration of people who go to states like Ohio and Indiana in the early and mid 1800s, and a lot of those individuals will register in these free Negro registers. And often that's where you will see not just adults registering, which is the primary group that registers, but children as well, because the whole family is about to leave the state, and so they want to make sure that everybody has documentation of their freedom.
And there are cases where almost whole communities seem to just get up and decide to leave.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit more about those migrations and where people were going to?
Yeah, so like I said, you see a lot of people going to the Midwest. Early on, there are even people who will leave Virginia and go to parts of the Deep South. But as time goes on and as the laws get more strict in those areas, that's less likely, but not completely cut off. But you do see people moving to places like Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, those areas. There are also a select number of people that I've seen in records who have left this area and gone to places like Philadelphia or Baltimore to try to connect themselves to these larger economies and bigger cities. So you see that too.
Yeah, and similar to the registration laws not being followed or being followed selectively depending on the community, the 1806 law indicating that freed people had to leave the state within a year is very similar. Is that you find people who, you know, their ability to stay is being challenged immediately, and other people who spend decades after freedom,
Right.
And so you can't sort of be, again, misled by the letter of the laws, because the communities really decide the enforcement of the laws,
Right.
which I think is a good thing to keep in mind when you're doing research.
Right, absolutely, yeah, and for those people who don't know about this 1806 law, basically the 1806 law was designed to discourage manumission, so the practice of taking enslaved people and making them free legally. This law was required that those people, upon obtaining their freedom, they were supposed to leave the state. And so what we find often is that they obtain their freedom and they don't leave the state. Now, why that happens, I think there are a variety of reasons. Some people have family connections and they don't want to leave for that reason. Many of them are valued within the community and they're still needed even though they've been given their freedom and the law says, oh, you're supposed to leave. Well, that doesn't work so well if you know, the local blacksmith who used to be enslaved and now is free is being forced out of the community. That's not a good thing, and so people will tend to look the other way when it comes to thinking about the enforcement of these laws. And you know, sometimes the law is being used to settle more personal issues. You'll see prosecutions show up maybe 5, 10 years, 20 years after somebody is supposed to leave. And why that happens, sometimes it seems to be personal, sometimes there are other things that might be going on, yeah.
Yeah, we have I was just looking back at a case from Powhatan County that my colleague Greg Crawford found a few years back involving the Cullens family, and they were a mother and I think 3 or 4 daughters who were to be manumitted when their enslavers' daughters died. So essentially, you know, he dies in 1833. They're to be freed when his daughters die, and by the time his daughters die, before the manumission can take place, one of the sisters dies. One of the enslaved sisters dies. And so they're getting ready to leave, and they think they can take their niece with them, and the estate sells her. And so they're suing to get her back, right? So they're really risking their newly free status by challenging, you know, this situation. And the man who purchased the niece and was planning on taking her to Richmond to sell her, a few months later, there's a grand jury indictment against the sisters, the newly freed sisters, for staying too long in the Commonwealth, and he's on the grand jury.
Right.
So he's being sued, and then he serves on the grand jury, which, I mean, again, that's a real, okay, you know, you could have picked up and left your niece here, but you're choosing to fight, and now we're, you know, going to use this law against you.
Right.
And they end up being re-enslaved
Right.
because they overstayed, and they find them they petition to stay. You could file a petition locally,
Right.
asking permission to remain in the Commonwealth, and their petition is refused, and they're re-enslaved. And one of their sisters who moved away actually chooses to come back and be re-enslaved with her sisters, so that she can stay with them. Which is, I mean, it's a really powerful story in a lot of ways, but it just shows how these laws can be leveraged if you've, you know, upset someone really interpersonally or,
Right.
or economically.
Right, exactly.
That brings up another interesting question to me, and that is the relationship between enslaved people and free people of color in communities. You know, sometimes there are quote-unquote marriages. We know legally that would not be binding, but there were many relations. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Right, yeah, so I mean, relationships between free people of color and enslaved people vary across the board. So, I mean, in the most simple way, you have some free people of color who, like you mentioned, have familial relationships to enslaved people. So they may be the children of enslaved people, a spouse to an enslaved person. You have mixed families where some members are enslaved, some are free, and that can change over time depending on whether one individual or not is able to become manumitted. But then also you have something on the other extreme, which is some free people of color own other people. They're enslavers. And depending on the context, sometimes that's because you will have a free person of color who might buy a friend, buy a family member, and hold them as a slave because under, say, Virginia law, that person if freed is supposed to leave, so they'll just keep that person as a slave instead of freeing that person. But in other cases, you definitely have free people of color who enslave other people for profit, just like everybody else in their community. And that's something that does seem to vary regionally. So you see more of those cases in the Deep South than you see in the Upper South. And there's also a connection, again, to like class in that part of the discussion, because you will see some of the more well-to-do free people of color being the people who are also the largest enslavers amongst free people of color. And they tend to live in these plantation districts in Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina. You see less of that in a place like Virginia or a place like Maryland. They do exist, but not in the same numbers that you would see in the Lower South. So you've got that. And then, I mean, of course, you have all kinds of other just day-to-day interactions between enslaved people and free people of color. People are friends. People are enemies. They're fighting. They're killing each other, those kind of things. You see people who are doing business together, drinking together, gambling together, all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, one of the things that you contend in your book is that the social landscape of the pre-Civil War South was more complicated and nuanced than simply whites on top and people of color on the bottom. Can you talk about the need to get beyond this kind of oversimplified narrative of our history and into more complex but a more complete understanding? You know, because it's easy to simplify things, but it's not always true.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, for one, I think that what you just said is one of the important reasons why we need to get into this more complicated understanding of relationships between free people of color and those people around them. And that's because that's the truth of the situation, right? These people did have very complex interactions with people. And I think by understanding the complex interactions of the past, it makes it more easy to understand what happens after the period that I'm talking about, so in the post-Civil War period, including in our own moment and some of the complicated relationships that people today have amongst each other. We have all these different forms of discrimination and empowerment of certain people, and certain people have more privileges than others. And I think it's more relatable when you can see those same patterns in the past and not think, oh, wow, what has happened to our society today? Because I think that's what happens when you write that very simplified narrative, is people look back and they're like, hey, what's going on, you know? But if you see some of these connections between the past and the present, I think things make a lot more sense. And again, that's just the reality of how society worked in that day and time. It wasn't a black and white society. There were class differences. Men and women's experiences as free people of color or people of any race would have been different in many contexts. People who had certain types of reputations in their communities, those reputations influenced the way that they were looked at by their neighbors, and that's really important to understand in that historical period as well as in our own time.
It seems to me there have been some really fine books, and yours being one, of course, that have kind of returned to look at free people of color in the pre-Civil War period. Are there a couple other books that you found really influential in your work and thinking about all the issues that you address in your book?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, we have the author of one of those books in the audience today, Melvin Ely, and his book, Israel and the Appomattox, I think is a really important book for those of us who study free people of color, because he is an early pioneer of exploring some of the records that people had not looked at before, but also demonstrating this more complex society that free people of color lived in. Another person whose work I looked at, especially before I actually went into grad school, was Jack D. Forbes, and he is a historian of Native American history. But his exploration in his work of race categories and how they actually operated in the colonial period and the 19th century I found to be really important, because I could see that some of the things I was finding also matched up with some of his work. And so that has been really key for me.
Great. Vince?
Yeah, I think that one of the, and you touched on this a little bit, but that drawing that through line, your conclusion makes that point very well, where you draw that through line between, nothing new under the sun, really, and so I do think that these more nuanced looks at our history, help us to be less scared about how things are and kind of understand things more, and that some of this has been going sort of back and forth for, since even before there was a country.
Right.
And so I do think that it's important to get that idea across, and to show that, again, one of the things that I thought was really important in reading your book was that, these folks had lives beyond their struggles. They were business people. They were, two of the record groups, I worked on a grant for two record groups that we processed here, one of which was the Petersburg Chancery records. And in doing research for that grant, Petersburg and Alexandria had the largest free black populations in Virginia for a period. And, that's reflected in the Chancery records, because you find lots of free people of color suing as business people. So you're getting these records reveal in depositions and the bills of complaint and things, what was going on in their business, in their lives, in just the sort of humdrum way that we all sort of live our lives. And it's not this sort of big struggle or just story of oppression or anything. It's just a story of a life, which I think can be really illuminating as well, because we tend to kind of get in this view of folks as like, well, they're just living this oppressed life all the time. And it's not that they're not, but that there are other aspects that make them a more complex person,
Right.
Which I think is really important to get across. And your book brings that up quite well, I think.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that. But yeah, I mean, I think that is important to see the humanity of these free people of color and not see them purely as examples of oppressed people, because that's not their whole lives. There's more to their lives than that. They have families, they have businesses, they have other struggles that are not necessarily connected to some of the discriminatory laws that I talk about in the book. And in recognizing that, again, we see their humanity, and I think it's easier to make connections to them and what they were going through by recognizing that.
One of the things that actually struck me as I was just thinking about what we were going to talk about tonight, and obviously there's lots of differences, but one of the sort of connections I made to the present day was thinking about undocumented immigrants or dreamers, and how, laws being passed, their status is sort of tenuous depending on the political winds, and how, when things are enforced, when they're not enforced, and kind of living with that uncertainty of, I'm rolling along and I'm going to college, I'm doing my thing, or I'm working and I'm doing my thing. So it's like, you can see where certain groups, who have this sort of nebulous status, as you said, not enslaved, but not quite fully free either, and the laws are constantly changing depending on factors outside of them. And so you really can draw connections, and I think this is true of maybe immigrant communities, historically, and then in the present day, as well as many other groups, women, how the status and laws around women's rights change, and you're allowed to do one thing at one point and then not another thing at another. So again, I think that being able to draw that through line, the past isn't just some sort of set in stone, no connection to the present kind of idea. I see a lot of things reflected in here that we're dealing with currently.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, again, just, going off of that the story of free people of color can inform so many of our current day discussions. So for instance, immigration issues, that was an issue for free people of color in this time period. It's state to state movement versus talking about borders across nations per se, although that's important too. But many of the states, both in the North and the South, had restrictions against free people of color moving into their borders. But of course, we see in that time, like we see in our own time, that these restrictions are enforced in different ways to different levels at different times and by different regimes. So there are people crossing those borders even though the law says something else. But there are also people who are being punished in certain cases for moving across those borders. While most people may not be punished, there are a few who are, and so that's important to recognize too. And I think we see similar patterns and varieties of different types of law enforcement in our own time.
Well, we'd also be interested in your thoughts. Maybe we could switch and have some of our audience members ask a few questions. Do we want to use the microphones? Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, Ashley. Looks like we have a question right down here in the front. We are recording this, so we wanted to get the questions as well as the answers. John?
Is it on?
Yeah, there you go.
Sorry,
Great.
okay.
No problem.
I'm really curious about the impact of the 1806 law. Do you have a sense of how many people were actually forced into, leaving the state? We hear lots of these stories of people who are able to find a way to stay, but I'm just curious as to how, do you have any sense of, thousands, millions, zillions, percentages, in whatever way one could could address that? I'm just really curious.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really difficult question to answer, just like many of questions around enforcement of the law, because it took place at the local level, right? And so in order to figure that out, you've got to go through all the court minute books. You've got to go through all the criminal papers trying to find those cases. What I can say from my observations is that the enforcement of those laws looks like it was more strict, say, in the 1850s than early on. But beyond that, giving you numbers, I can't give you specific numbers. And also, it would require us trying to find out how many people have been manumitted, right? So that in itself is an even more complicated process.
You get a little bit of that, but I don't know, it may be just peculiar, and I'm kind of a Richmond guy. The First African Baptist Church, you do see people being dismissed, and it will say their status and sometimes where they're going. But the percentage of those is fairly low, so it's still a total guess. But good Baptists, of course, you get a letter of dismissal, and then you, in turn, get accepted into your new church. So that is one window into, and First African had about 3,000 members. So it was a pretty significant chunk of the total free people of color population, well, enslaved and free people of color, because the church is another place where free people and enslaved people are having, relationships.
Right.
And I would add that, it depends, you might have someone who is, within that year leaving because of the law. You could have someone who is staying even though the law says you have to leave. You could have someone who's stayed longer than a year who gets re-enslaved and then transported to the Deep South. And one of the things that the Virginia did was that it would enslaved and free people who were convicted of felonies, and this, this would have qualified, be re-enslaved and sold, and the money from those sales by the state went to the literary fund, which funded public education for poor white children. And the state did a lot of this. And there was a point, too, where because of these laws, the sort of vagrancy-ish laws that were sort of dragnetting in a lot of free people of color, you have the penitentiary gets filled with enslaved and free people of color to the point where the superintendent's saying, we've got to do something about this. Oh, let's put them on the public works. So they get sentenced by the governor to public works. And these people who were, convicted of larceny, which may have had a short jail term and then, they're gone, if they were white, are now working for the rest of their days on the canal or on the railroads, which is really the beginning of the convict leasing system that comes later after the Civil War for some of the same reasons.
Mel?
Warren, one of the interesting things you do in the book is you delineate the development during the course of the 19th century of, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but two groups among whites. And one is the group that you call the radicals or the racial extremists. And then you identify another group who, at least at times, you identify as allies of free people of color. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about who these groups were, what they were up to, and what their motives were.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, so that is definitely a important distinction that I draw in the book when it comes to understanding the place of free people of color, is to look at their white neighbors and how they operate. And so what I'm trying to show is that we see the development of all of these discriminatory laws, and sometimes we see laws that are proposed that fail. And when that happens, I want to explain to people why is it the case that some of these laws are successful and why others fail. And in doing that, I need to demonstrate that there are clearly people who are for these laws and also people who are opposing certain types of laws. And so the people who I discuss who support most of the discriminatory laws against free people of color, I describe them as radicals. And the reason I describe them as radicals is because most of these people, I would think, would have been identified, and I would definitely identify them, as pro-slavery and in many cases also white supremacists, openly. I mean, that's how they would have operated in that day and time. But say in Virginia in the 1850s, to be pro-slavery is not necessarily a radical position. There are many politicians who would identify as pro-slavery. But it's another thing to connect the issue of slavery specifically to free people of color and then go about attacking them constantly through proposals and through the law. And so that's why I'm trying to draw that distinction, because you can have individuals who are pro-slavery who will also help free people of color. But there are others who use free people of color as political objects for their own gain within the discussions that are going on in Virginia and other states at that time. And so by doing that, I think it helps to explain again why you will see pro-slavery people maybe opposing laws that discriminate against free people of color, but then at the same time working to shore up slavery in Virginia or other places.
And on that subject of motivations of whites, can you talk a little bit about the colonization movement and sort of how that impacts and intersects with free people of color?
Yeah, so I mean, the colonization movement is something that becomes popular in, we'll say, the 18 teens. The idea was around before then, but that's when we start to see serious organizing around this. And so this is a movement to send free people of color and enslaved people who are either about to be freed or recently freed to Africa and other parts of the world. So there are also people being sent to the Caribbean, for example, by the colonizationists. And so most of the people who support colonization and organize for colonization are white, Many of them are influential politicians across the nation, people you've probably heard of, presidents, etc. And so early on during the colonization movement, we do see some support amongst free people of color for colonization. I think some of those people feel desperate and they don't have any other choice, and so they're thinking, hey, maybe a colony in Africa would be worthwhile. I could have certain rights in Africa that I can't have here or somewhere in the Caribbean. But then at the same time, you also have a growing movement amongst free people of color against colonization, and they see colonization as a movement in support of white supremacy. So it's a removal movement, right? They're going to get rid of us. They're going to take us away from our homeland and send us somewhere where we don't know anything. And so I think that that's really an important thing to understand about colonization is it's very divisive amongst free people of color, but ultimately I think a lot of free people of color end up being against it. And that push against colonization, I think, becomes more organized over time as we get to, say, the 1850s, where there's a little bit of a revitalization of colonization again. We see a really strong pushback. And that pushback happens in the South as well as in the North.
Yeah, it's important to realize the American Colonization Society had chapters everywhere, in the Midwest, in the North, New England, so it was a true national organization. There was something else I was going to say there, but I can't remember. Oh, speaking of prominent colonizationists, Judge Marshall, whose house is literally right over there, on the other side of the street, was, I believe, the president of the Virginia Colonization Society early on. All right, other questions from the audience? We must have some other questions right over here. Ann?
Hey, thanks for talking about the colonization. It's one of my curiosities. I'm also curious about rebellion, especially Nat Turner's rebellion, its impacts on free people of color and their status in the state.
Yeah, so I do spend a bit of time in my book discussing the Turner Rebellion and free people of color's connection to the Turner Rebellion. So I think a general way to look at that is that there are certain effects that, or certain activities that impact the lives of free people of color in Virginia, especially in areas close to the rebellion, that don't necessarily impact the larger population of free people of color. So in some of those local areas, you see immediately after the rebellion, arrests. So people are being arrested on these petty crimes, and often these are petty violations that are related to some of these laws that we've been discussing, discriminatory laws that usually aren't being enforced, say these manumission laws that we've talked about over and over again. After the rebellion, all of a sudden people will be jailed on charges related to that. Now, how I try to frame the larger issue around free people of color's connection to the rebellion is I see the rebellion as a grand opportunity for some of these people I describe as radical pro-slavery people or these extreme white supremacist people to attack free people of color and have legislation passed affecting their lives that in normal times wouldn't have been passed. And so we see that happen in Virginia in relation to, say, colonization. The colonization movement received state funding following the Turner Rebellion. In other parts of the South, we see similar things. So there are restrictions placed on preaching or gathering, things of that nature. And the Turner Rebellion is being used as a way to pass those laws. And again, I don't think in another time that they would have been successfully passed had that rebellion not taken place. But then, you know, the radicals in this particular context can act like, hey, I'm doing something to shore up slavery by attacking free people of color, by restricting their movements, and making it harder for them to collaborate with enslaved people, because that's often the justification that is given to limit the rights of free people of color, is that somehow they're going to be the natural allies of enslaved people, and they're going to collaborate with enslaved people and cause more trouble. Now, if you look deeper, often the ideas that were supported, say, following the Nat Turner Rebellion were not new, and there were people who had been lobbying to pass these restrictions for a long time. And the reasons they were trying to support these restrictions or have these restrictions implemented vary across the board, but often I do see economic connections between the original support for these restrictions and then what happens after the Turner Rebellion. So for instance, economic competition is something that plays an important role in some of the restrictions that are passed after the rebellion. Clearly, colonization was not a new idea in 1831 when the Turner Rebellion took place, but the colonizationists were able to use that environment of people being scared and politicians looking for a way to act tough in order to pass those restrictions.
Great, we have another question over here.
Hi, I'm an archivist here at the library, and I think a lot about, on a day-to-day basis, how we describe the records that the people that we're talking about are in.
Right.
And I think it's important for at least us as librarians and archivists to remember that, and researchers, that the records themselves are written through a white perspective, and many times there's a white clerk that's passing judgment on these people's color of skin, their complexion, those types of things.
Right.
So I'm just curious if you have thoughts around that and thinking about the types of terminology that's most inclusive to describe some of these people. You know, in many cases, should we be using the historic language like mulatto and Negro? Or should we be, you know, categorizing them all as free people of color? Just in general, how you think about that, and but from a researcher and scholar kind of perspective.
Yeah, so that's a really difficult issue to deal with. I mean, you can clearly tell from the language that I'm using that I use the term free people of color. And I think, for one, I use that, well, I have multiple reasons for using it. One, because this is the terminology that I most often see free people of color use for themselves. And even some of their descendants, these are terms that they recognize versus some of the other language that may have appeared in those records, say free Negro. You'll rarely see these individuals refer to themselves as free Negroes in that time period, because, and I think, you know, there's something to this like idea of being a person of color, like it reinforces the idea of personhood, and I think that's really important to the people of that time. And also, I think it's something that reflected the diversity of this population. These people understood themselves as very diverse in their ancestries and backgrounds, and so I think that is also why they tended to use that terminology. And then say, you know, the term mulatto, again, that's something that people generally don't refer to themselves as, but other people around them will refer to themselves in that way. Now, as far as like thinking about this for an issue of archives, I mean, I think that as a researcher, you know, I'm familiar with the terminology. I recognize it as it is what it is as far as how it's written out, and then it's my job as a historian to take that information and interpret it so that people can understand it. And that may be me having to explain to you what a free person of color is. But I don't know, does that kind of answer the question? Okay, yeah. Yeah, and I guess I'll throw this out there too, because I've seen this in some of the records recently, and I don't know how you all want to deal with this in the future. But I have seen that some of the more recently processed records, people are trying to label whether somebody is quote unquote African American or white in the record. And I've seen many records where there are free people of color who are being listed as white because they're not being directly categorized as a free Negro or free mulatto, because sometimes they don't actually appear in the record with a racial category. So I think that is something else to think about too, that sometimes people are not being explicitly discriminated against in the record in that way. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And all the clerks are not operating the same. They're not all thinking about these issues in the same way, that there is some variability even amongst them, about how they see the people. So, you know, you could have a white clerk who has a very negative viewpoint about free people of color, but there are other clerks who are just not thinking about it in that way.
Great. Well, I want to give some time for Dr. Milteer to sign some books. If you get a chance, after you get your book signed, I think the gallery is open. Take a look, because there are a lot of petitions in there. It's about petitioning the government in the antebellum period. And you'll see a number of the petitions that people did apply to stay in the state. And we're going to have several cases out in the lobby which will have examples of some of the records we're talking about. We wanted to do that particularly because Virginia Untold, as Vince said, is we are digitizing a lot of these records for our online Virginia Untold database. And so you get a chance to see the real thing. And also just offer to you, you know, if this inspires you and you want to do some research on your family, come and visit us. We are kind of the place if you want to do Virginia family history. So that's also a standing offer. Okay, I think we're going to do some book signing now. One more big round of applause for our author today.
Thank you all.